Welcome, everyone, to the first session of All in the Family, Problematic Relationships in the Law Codes of Deuteronomy with Rabbi David Silber, a continuation of his ongoing Sunday Tanakh class. Rabbi Silber is the founder and dean of Rabbi Silber, and we're glad to learn with him, whether you're just joining for this class or you've been following along for the past few sessions. One of the foci in the legal section of Deuteronomy relates to complicated issues about marriage and family relationships. These 4 sessions will undertake a study of texts relating to the captive consort, the rebellious child, the defaming husband, and the recalcitrant levir, the choletzet. Sources for today's class are going to come primarily from Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua. If you have your own Tanakh, you're always welcome to follow along with that. Sources will occasionally come up on screen from Sefaria when psukim are being quoted. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your questions. You can, when Rabbi Silber pauses for questions, please do ask. If you're not able to ask because for whatever reason, you can also ask in chat and I will relay those to Rabbi Silber. Please mute yourself when you're not actively speaking. And with that, I'm handing over the mic to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much, Kayla. Okay, we'll begin. These were not initially scheduled, but decided to add a few sessions since we have been studying the book of Dvarim. For those that have been studying Dvarim with me, these are 4 distinct sessions, and they're focusing on a set of laws that appear within the law code of the book of Dvarim. Dvarim, between chapters essentially 11 and chapter 26, have many, many laws, more than any other place in the Torah. We find a lot of different laws in Sefer Dvarim. Some of them have appeared in one form or another earlier in the Torah. Many of them appear to be completely new. And let me just say a word about the law codes of the Torah in general. In general, the Torah is a story, but from on several occasions we have a separate code of law. And the first point I wanted to make, we've discussed some of this in the past, is that these different codes of law, each of them is not a complete code. The one in Sefer Shmot, Mishpatim, set of laws, 3 chapters, but it's very incomplete. The same is true in chapter 19 and beyond in the previous book, in Vayikra, excuse me. And here in Sefer Dvarim, though, the code is much longer. There are many new laws and some repeats, but it's certainly not complete. What's interesting is, though, that there's a focus in Sefer Dvarim on certain laws that don't appear really earlier or appear virtually not at all. And the 2 main foci that, if you read the codes of Sefer Dvarim, but 2 of the main foci of Sefer Dvarim are, first of all, laws that relate to a war that we don't have earlier in the Torah at all. And in Sefer Dvarim, there's a discussion of war in several places. I'll get to that. That's one. And the second one is laws relating in one form or another to family or to marriage. Typically things that don't work out well. That's where you need law more than any other place. And in reflecting on this, I just want to say that from one, we understand why actually laws of war, which appear in 5 or 6 different places in Sefer Devarim, it's very understandable why it doesn't appear earlier. Because the story earlier of the Torah is a focus on the Exodus from Egypt, the journey through the desert. There are a couple of wars that engage Israel as they travel through the desert. There's the attack of Amalek. There's the story in chapter 21, Knani Melech Arad. But the point is, the focus is not the land or entering the land. The focus is preliminary to the land. Sefer Devarim, on the other hand, is completely different. Sefer Devarim contains a blueprint for what happens when you enter the land. So that, for example, in the previous sessions, we focused on leadership. There's a section here on the king, the responsibilities of the king, the prohibitions that relate to a king, etc. That's only in Sefer Devarim. You have the focus on the judges, setting up a system of justice, including the high court. Then there's, in 2 different places in this book, a discussion of the prophet. Prophet has a role, and one of the institutional leaders, etc. Then, of course, there is some discussion about the priests the Kohanim and the Leviim. So there's this discussion, when you come into the land, you have to set up some kind of government. There's going to be some kind of ruling body. And the book of Devarim, which is a focus when you enter the land. So it talks about the institutions. It also says that when you enter the land, there are going to be different rules because there's a centralized government. Centralized both in terms of the court. There's a high court in Sefer Devarim, but centralized, and we didn't get into this too much in our studies, maybe in the following sessions we'll talk a bit about that, but there's a focus on centralized worship. When you enter the land, there's one place where you can bring sacrifices. Unlike prior to that, you can bring sacrifices in many places, etc. But the Torah says when you enter the land, there's only one place, which is far away, perhaps. And there are all kinds of rules, therefore, all kinds of rules and leniencies that relate to the fact that if you want to eat a piece of meat, when you were in the desert, you could go to the Mishkan, bring a sacrifice, and eat the meat. But if you're living far away from the temple, you can't do that. It'd be a great burden. So the Torah has certain leniencies. I'm not getting into the details. But my point is, if you're talking about the land, preliminary to living in the land, you have to capture the land. So we understand very, very well why in the book of Devarim, there is, and only in the book of Devarim, there are all kinds of laws relating to war. Because you enter the land, there are people living in the land, Canaanites or whatever, there's going to be wars. What are the rules of war? And not only that, there's also rules of war about engaging with other countries, with faraway countries or faraway peoples, because you're going to have a state, and one of the institutions of the state is an army. I'm not getting into the question whether in the Torah or beyond there's a standing army. Maybe there's a small standing army, etc., but it doesn't matter. The point is, there's an army. There's an army, there's a commander-in-chief of the army. The next leader after Moshe and Joshua is a military man, etc. So we understand, it's easy to understand why in this book, which is all about setting up your own country, your own state, there's going to be a discussion of the army, of war, rules of war, as the Torah presents them, etc. All that is totally understandable, and prior to Devarim, it's not necessary to talk about it yet. That's understandable. What is less understandable is the complete absence, or sort of the minimal presentation of marital law and marital responsibility. I'm not saying it doesn't appear earlier to some extent. You have earlier, but it's much, much more a focus in the book of Devarim. And then the question is, how does one terminate a marriage? Divorce appears only in Sefer Devarim. There's no mentioning that earlier, and it's hard to understand. Presumably, marriage and divorce apply prior to entering the land. Seems to have nothing to do with entering the land, etc., etc. The husband who makes claims about his wife, and appears in Sefer Devarim, we'll discuss that not this week, maybe next. Moti Shemba, one of the 4 weeks, etc. So that's less understandable. Why the Torah waited till Sefer Devarim, or let's put it this way, why there's an absence of this in the other books, a relative absence, as opposed to Sefer Devarim. So I did want to say one thing about that. Maybe we'll have an opportunity at some other occasion to delve more deeply into this idea. And before we start looking at the first situation of call it marriage. It's a question whether it's marriage or not. We'll get to that. But I want to say something else about Sefer Devarim generally. And that is, what is the relationship of the people to God in Sefer Devarim? That's a big question. So, yes, I've spoken in the past, we've discussed in the past in other contexts, that the God of Sefer Devarim is not a God who lives amongst you. That is certainly the case. The God of Sefer Devarim resides up there in heaven someplace. Later in the book, it talks about the one who makes the confession about bringing the appropriate gifts to the various parties who are to receive gifts, vidui maaser, and a part of that is in that prayer, or the confession, it really sounds more like a prayer, Hashkifa mimon kodshecha min hashamayim. Oh God, look down upon us from your heavenly abode. The God of Sefer Devarim lives someplace in heaven, wherever that may be, does not walk together with us. The God of the Torah, of Vayikra, walks amongst us. There is the Mishkan. V'shachanti b'tocham, I will dwell amongst them. But the God of Sefer Devarim does not dwell amongst us. There is a temple, which we visit 3 times a year, but even the temple, the book of Devarim does not suggest, essentially, that God dwells in the temple. The book of Devarim speaks of the temple as the place, HaMakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, Losum et Shemi Sham, where my name is there. The temple has God's name, but it doesn't necessarily have God's presence. It's a kind of communication place. The prayers ascend through the temple to heaven. The sacrifices are accepted by God, but by the God who dwells in heaven. So that's obviously the case. When one reads the Chumash, that's obviously true. We've spoken about that and the implications. I'm not going to get into that again. But I want to say something else about the relationship of God to Israel in the book of Devarim. Many years ago, I was in Israel, and I heard a class, very well-respected Talmid Chacham, who deals a lot with Bible, Tanakh. Interesting person, doesn't matter who it is. And he made the statement that the God of Sefer Devarim, the relationship of God to the people in Sefer Devarim is that of father to son, parent to child. And the verse, Banim atem l'Hashem Elohechem, says earlier, you are God's children. And there are other verses as well that suggest that the book of Devarim sees Israel as God's children. When you get to the prophetic writings, as we are well familiar, there we have a different relationship that is suggested by many of the prophetic writings, that Israel is God's consort, God's lover, the image of God as husband. God as husband, and Israel as God's devoted wife, sometimes less than devoted wife, but wife. That's a later. That comes later in our Bible. Now, there is no question that there's a great truth to that, in the sense that certainly later it does suggest on more than one occasion of the relation of God and Israel as a kind of husband-wife relationship. But what I took exception with when I was sitting in the listening to the Shir was that I don't believe that in Sefer Devarim it's only about parent and child. I believe that in Sefer Devarim it's also about husband and wife. And the reason I suggest that, maybe we'll come to that in our studies at some point, is towards the end of this book, which talks about the covenant between God and Israel. The book of Devarim is about a new covenant. There is the old covenant, which obtains the covenant of Sinai, that holds. But there's also a second covenant, the covenant of what's called the Brit of Arvot Moav, which begins in chapter 29 explicitly and relates to other parts of the latter part of the book, the last section of the book. And in that description of the covenant, it's about what the Torah recalls, actually. There it talks about breaking the covenant. Breaking the covenant in secret. In secret. Lest be one amongst you who thinks secretly. They think to themselves secretly, this doesn't apply to me. I can do my own thing. B'shrirut li bi'elech. And the Torah calls that out. The Torah says, no, you can't do that. The hidden things belong to God. That God knows what's in your heart. And the text that the Torah recalls in Sefer Devarim, of course, in many ways, we've discussed it in the past, we'll get to it again, is the section in the Torah of the Sota, the adulterous wife, the one that the husband accuses of infidelity. And that's part and parcel of this covenant. So the idea that it's only about father-child in the book of Devarim is a bad mistake. Actually, it's a bad mistake. Already in Sefer Devarim, the relationship and the deep relationship is husband-wife, two lovers, and I'm wondering whether because of that, it's in Sefer Devarim that we really have, and the only place we really have a description of the relationship between husband and wife. And I wanted to say that our focus, I call this All in the Family, but still with a smile on my face, because it's about the codes deal with problems. We need law specifically when there are problems. And the book of Devarim talks about problematic issues relating to marriage, all kinds of problematic issues. But the book of Devarim does contain with it something positive about marriage. It's not only the problems. For example, I'll give you one example where the Torah speaks about perhaps what marriage should be. And that's found, let's see if I can find that verse. Let's see, chapter, where is that? I think it's chapter 24. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, chapter 24, verse number 3. I'll just read it to you. 3 or 5. No, verse number 5. Chapter 24, verse 5. One verse. Ki kach ish isha chadasha. When a man takes a new wife, a bride, a man marries a bride. Lo yetze batzava, lo yavar alav l'chol davar. No ki yeh leveito shana achat, v'simach et ishto asher lokach. When a man takes a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He is exempt for a year for the sake of his household, to give happiness, the simach, joy, to bring joy or happiness to the woman he has married. So here the Torah says explicitly that there's an obligation. It puts in terms of the husband's obligation to make the wife happy. The simach et ishto asher lokach. This is what the Torah says. This is the exemption from the army. Whether this exempts you from any army service or only some army service, etc., all those kinds of questions the Talmud deals with. Talmud says that if it was called a Milchemet Mitzvah, it's like a war of self-defense. These exemptions don't hold. That's already in the Gemara. That's a separate question. But there is an exemption from the army. A newlywed is exempt in the Torah from the army, and that's just as a soldier. It says lo yavor l'chol davar. It seems to be even more inclusive. L'chol davar, maybe any purpose, maybe beyond just combat, other things as well. Can't be assigned for any purpose. He has one obligation for a year to make his wife happy. So here we have this idea of marriage as a very powerful relationship. I mention that because we'll deal with problems here. That's where we need the law to deal with problems and all kinds of sticky situations. But I do want to make the point that Torah is explicit about this. And not only that, the Torah also talks about going into the army. One of the people exempt from fighting in the war, back in chapter 20, is someone who has just gotten engaged, but is not yet living together with his wife. So that person is one of the people who's exempt from going to the army. That's in chapter 20. That begins in chapter 20, verse number 1. Ki tetzei milchama levecha. And there it talks about exemptions. There's a whole section there about the army, which is not our main topic at all, but it's relevant to what we're going to discuss in a minute. And there's certain exemptions from the army. There are 3 exemptions. Somebody who is engaged but not yet married, somebody who has planted, say, a vineyard but has not harvested the crops, right? Someone who, what the third one is, let's see, was the third one? Let's see. Where's the third one? Someone I think who's bought a house, yes, who has a new house. Has a new house, but hasn't built a new house, has not dedicated yet, whatever that means. So the new house is you're exempted from the army, presumably because you have other things on your mind. You won't be fully there, and we don't want people in the army who aren't fully there. So these are certain exemptions. I'm not getting into that now. Maybe in the future we'll talk about these exemptions. But once again, took a engaged but not living together, right? He's a Rashi Shav. So the Torah does understand, or clearly understands, is talks about this relationship. It's being very significant. I say all that because we're going to get to the situations that we're going to deal with are the negative situations. So this is my suggestion about the presence in this book of marriage law, because the marriage law, the relationships, when you enter the land, it's about deep relationships with each other. We become a community. When you're in the land, unlike before the land, there's a sense of community. We'll talk about that later as well. Full community has to do with entering the land, taking responsibility for everybody else. That's different when you're in the land and outside the land. That's clear in the Torah, and that's a very important theme of Sefer Dvarim. So full responsibility for the other, one of the examples of full responsibility for the other is, of course, marriage. There's a responsibility to make sure the other person is doing well, is in good shape, is happy. So that's related, I think, to the larger project of Sefer Dvarim, building community and what it means to have a community in the sense of mutual responsibility. We all become responsible for everybody else. No one can say, I'll do my own thing. That's not what Sefer Dvarim is about. Just want to make that clear. I know these things may seem obvious, they're quite obvious to me, but they're worthwhile saying in any event. Okay, that's by way of introduction to our topic. And the first topic in this discussion of All in the Family, we focus on chapter 21, verse number 10. It's interesting that it begins with the words ki say. And in fact, when we read the Torah, we finish the Torah in a year. That's our practice, or the prevalent practice of the Jewish people, put it that way. And Parshat ki say is one of the Parshiot. Ki say, it's a Parsha. When you think about it, so we actually begin with ki say, beginning of the Parsha is ki say. But what's curious is that Parsha, at the beginning, the first few verses of the Parsha, which begins in chapter 21, verse number 10, you would think would belong to the previous Parsha, the Parsha of Shoftim, because chapter 20, which we just saw, begins also with the words ki say, and it's also about war. Ki say la milchama oivecha. When you go to war against your enemy, etc. And there's a whole section over there, chapter 20, verse number 1, through chapter 20, verse number 9, about preparations for war. The troops have gathered, and then there's a procedure where the priest comes out and makes a statement, then some of the leadership comes out and makes a statement. The priest says to everybody, have no fear. God is with you. God is going to fight for you. Don't be afraid. It says you see the enemy in front of you. There's so many of them. We are outnumbered. So the priest says, it's his job. The priest says, do not be afraid. Al tiru, don't be frightened. God is with you, right? God is going to defeat you. God is bringing about salvation. God is going before you to save you. That's what the priest says in the beginning of chapter 20. This is the beginning of the section on war. And then it's interesting, that's what the priest says. And then in chapter 20, verse number 5, V'dibru hashotrim. But then the shotrim, they're a different kind of leadership. They're leaders of the people. They're not priests. They're leaders of the people, and they're not judges. Because judges are shoftim. These are shotrim. And they say, okay, before we get to war, there are people that are exempt. And I mentioned the three people that are exempt. But then, and why are they exempt? They're exempt because maybe they will die and never be able to get married, or never be able to have that new house or the vineyard, etc. So, and then the priest says, and by the way, anybody who's afraid should go home, lest that person who's fearful goes into battle and discourages and disheartens the other troops. So that's how the section begins. In other words, on one end, the priest says, God is with you, have no fear, we're going to win. But the whole next section is about, we may win, but there are going to be casualties. And in fact, we don't want someone to go into war engaged, and perhaps they will die and never be able to get married or have a field or a house, etc. So there's a kind of reality factor over here. And then there's another factor, which is someone who's afraid. In other words, there is reason to be afraid because it's very dangerous. So such a person, if someone who can't overcome their fears, anybody who has no fear at all is probably a fool. That's the point. Everybody has fears. The question is the extent of the fears. Are they rational? Are they irrational, et cetera, et cetera? We don't want anybody there who's going to discourage other people. So it's very interesting. On one hand, there's this statement, God is with you, God will bring victory. And then there's reality factor. God may bring victory, but it comes at a price, perhaps. It may come at a terrible price. So that's how it begins. This is all about preparations for war. The Ramban thinks that they're not in the proper order, that the Torah is written out of order. At first, we talk about people being exempted, the exemptions. And then afterwards, those that remain, then the priest says, God will bring victory. Be that as it may, whether it's in chronological order or not, that's the first point. The next section deals with what happens during the war. And the Torah has it's unclear exactly what the Torah is saying, but and so what the Torah is saying probably doesn't accord with the way a lot of people feel today about war. Whom are you permitted to kill or not kill? I'm not getting into that now. We're happy to deal with it later, but that's what happens during the war. You before you have a war, you turn to the other side and say, if you want to make peace, there won't be a war. Whether that applies to all the nations or only the nations that are far away, but the nations that dwell amongst you, kill them all, men, women, and children, that's a separate question. Rashi has one opinion, the Ramban and the Rambam have a different opinion. How to read it is an interesting question, but that's about what happens during the war itself. That begins in chapter 20, verse number 10, and all the way down to verse number 18. And then there are other rules of war, etc. At the end, about the siege, what happens, about destroying trees, etc., that kind of thing. It's the end of chapter 20. And then chapter 21, the first 9 verses, what happens when you find a corpse and you don't know how that person died? The person was killed, but we don't have the murderer. It does not appear to be war-related in the sense that someone died in war. It appears to be someone who was killed, not in war. Perhaps it's murder. We don't know. And then we have this whole ritual of the Egla Arufa. But it does deal with death. It deals with responsibility for death, etc. And that's the end. That's chapter 21 up to verse number 9. And then we get to our section. Choletzet. Choletzet l'milchama. It goes back to war. What happens if during the war something happens? So when you read this, you say to yourself that the order is very strange, actually, because I would have expected choletzet of chapter 21 to be before, I would say before the Egla Arufa, together with the other 3 sections about war. But that's not the case. You have section ABC about war, then we jump to the Egla Arufa, then we go back to war, and the way it's the parshiot is set up, we read this, we begin a new parsha with this choletzet. For those of you that may have be Torah readers, got to be careful when you get to choletzet because you got to make sure you got the right choletzet. Choletzet l'milchama of chapter 21, verse 10, has a parallel say a milchama of chapter 20. I know myself, it's about Koreh. I once made that mistake. I started reading the wrong say. But in any event, why is it here? It's a good question. And the answer is actually simple. It's a very straightforward answer. And that is that the parsha that we have over here in chapter 21, verse number 10, bridges two different things. On one hand, it's about war. But on the other hand, it's an introduction to what I would call rules relating to married life or to problematic married life. And so it's both. It's both about war, but in a sense, the way we have set it up, it begins this new section of relationship of man and woman, husband, wife, etc. And typically, what often happens in the Torah and certainly in the Mishnah and certainly in the Gemara, they bring liminal cases. What's interesting for the Talmud are those kind of cases that don't seem to fit in clearly into one particular section. They're on the boundaries. It's precisely the laws that are on the boundaries which are most interesting. That's where you can test certain hypotheses. That's when you can get a deeper understanding of different sections of law, how they relate to each other, etc. So this next section, which begins in chapter 21, verse 10, and just goes through verse number 14, is precisely that. It's one of those sections in which the subject is not 100% clear. So let's begin with this. It's a well-known section, and let's begin with our discussion. I'll stop in a few minutes and take comments or questions. Let's just begin. Ki tetzei milchama alevecha, unetano Hashem rohecha biyadecha v'shavita shivyo. If you go to war, you go out to war against your enemy, and God has given the enemy into your hands. You've been victorious. Vishavita shivyo, you have taken captives. Now, earlier the Torah talked about captives in war, but by captives, it doesn't only mean human captives, but the Torah speaks earlier about taking spoils of war, booty or spoils of war. That's found earlier in chapter 20, beginning in verse number 10. There it talks about how one conducts war against enemies that are far away from you. You are required to offer peace. Now, peace means peace, but they're subservient to you. It's not peace, no war, and you go your way, I'll go my way. Okay, not. But you are subjugating them in some sense, but no one is killed. If they agree to make peace, shalom, fine. In the next, right, and then it says in chapter 20, verse number 14, what if they don't make peace? They fight you, then you kill the men. But rak hanoshim v'ataf habema v'chol isha ashkol asher yeboir kol shlola tavos lach. Then if there is a war, I would say the men are considered to be combatants. Let's call them combatants are killed, or potential combatants perhaps. But the women, children, and all of the possessions are yours. Torah calls that shalom. Okay, the booty is yours. You can take that. So that's not true if you fight the seven nations, etc. Leave that for now. Now we have this first verse. Back to our verse. You go to war, vishavito shivyo, and you take captives. Now the question is, how does this relate to what it said earlier in the Torah? Because in the Torah it said, if you're fighting against the seven nations, there are no captives. Everybody's killed. So one possible reading is, it's not talking about that kind of war. It's talking about a kind of war where you can take captives, where you're permitted to take captives. Don't have to kill everybody. Okay, that's a separate question. How do you relate this verse to what it said a few verses earlier? I just want to digress for 1 minute without getting into this in any detail, but I just want to mention something that I think is very interesting. And that is that the book after Sefer Devarim is the book of Yoshua. Book of Yoshua, a good part of the book, is about Joshua, who's the leader of the people, is the general. He was a commander-in-chief under Moshe. He's a general. And the book of Yoshua describes wars that are fought against the peoples that live in the land, the Canaanites. And it talks in more than one place about killing them all. Men, women, children, they're all killed. Which is what it seems to say in Devarim, chapter 20. Although even there's a big question whether that's the case. We're not dealing with that. But what is very interesting, actually, is the following. We're not studying the book of Yoshua. In fact, the book of Yoshua is not a book I would necessarily study with young people at all, and I would wait to study it later. In Israel, they study Yoshua all the time. It's a separate question as to the curriculum. But what's interesting is that in the book of Yoshua, the first battle, of course, we all know that, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. And the battle of Jericho is, of course, the Canaanites. And Jericho is utterly destroyed. There, of course, there's a whole thing. There's a procession. They walk around Jericho. They blow the shofar 7 times and this and that. God truly is fighting in that story. The walls come tumbling down. But in the story of Yericho, which is the ultimate war against the Canaanites, and we read this yesterday as the Haftorah, Joshua sends spies into Jericho, and they go to the house of a prostitute named Rachav. And from Rachav, they get all kinds of information about the mentality of the Canaanites. And Rachav actually protects them and saves their life because the king has found out about the spies. And Rachav says to the spies, they're called spies, listen, when you come back into the land, I want to make sure that you don't kill me. And not just me, my brother, sister, parents, and the whole mishpacha, and our possessions, the works. And the spies say yes. And we swear we will do this, provided that you keep this a secret, etc., etc. They have a deal. And later in the book of Yoshua, which was not part of the Haftorah, that's exactly what happens. They saved Rachav, they saved the whole entire family, etc., 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 etc. And Rachav dwells amongst the Jewish people. The Medrash has her marrying Joshua, which is not in the text. But what's interesting is the first great battle against Jericho is a violation of what the Torah seems to say about war in Sefer Dvarim. That Rachav is actually saved. She's spared. Not just Rachav herself, that's one thing, but the entire family. And then you come to the next battle the next great battle against the Canaanites. And there we have the story of the Givonim. Givonim they dress up and they pretend to be from a faraway land. And they say, we heard about your God, we want to make a treaty with you. And the Jewish people make a treaty with the Givonim. Then we discover a few days later, they're not a faraway land. They're a Canaanite nation that dwells amongst us. And the people say to Joshua, this is made under false pretenses. They tricked us. Let's kill them. And Joshua says, we made a treaty with them. We can't do that. We promised. We took an oath. We promised. We have a treaty. We can't do it. And they don't harm the Givonim. They say you're going to be, water carriers, etc. But then the great war against the Canaanites takes place when the other Canaanites attack the Givonim, and Israel defends the Givonim. It's actually a defensive struggle to protect the Givonim who misled them. So my point is, something to think about for those who want to study the book of Yoshua. You have all the rules of war over here in Sefer Dvarim, but then the rules of war seem to be completely disregarded when it comes to the book of Yoshua. In other words, we don't kill the Givonim, and we don't kill Rachav. On the contrary. So the question is always, what's on the books, and how do people behave? Those are not always the same thing. And the question is how that relates. And we can understand very well that Joshua, who's the general of the army, will be more than happy to have the Givonim as a kind of ally, because the Givonim are an important and powerful ally, and that we fight a war in defense of the Canaanites, the primary war in defense of the Canaanites. It's very interesting. I simply point that out. It's not our main topic here. Anyway, now we get to our little topic here. You go to war against your enemy, and you take captives, okay? Let's say we take captives from the non-Canaanite captives. And now we have the following. You, the soldier, sees in war an Eshet, a beautiful woman, Eshet Yifat Toar, and you desire her. The Torah is talking to the soldier. And here we have the first problem about how to read this parsha. So, generally speaking, in these classes, what we're trying to look at is, what does the text seem to say? Less significant to us is, it's important, but not for our purposes in these classes, how has this text been understood by the rabbinic tradition, by the various commentaries, which is very important to know that. But what our goal is, we call Pshuta Shel Mikra. What is the plain meaning of the text? And here is a great dispute among the commentaries and the Talmudim, the Bava Yerushalmi, what these three words mean. Here, the translation that we have, this translation, which is JPS, you desire her and would take her to wife. Which I believe is the best translation. Personally, I think that's a shot. I think the Ramban thinks that as well. You would take her for a wife. In other words, you see this, the soldier sees this beautiful woman. It's in combat. She's a captive. And then what? She's very beautiful. He desires her. So what happens? Means, and then he takes her. So he sleeps with her. Is that what's going on? Or it doesn't mean that. It means you would take her. It's a beautiful woman, but the Torah says don't do anything until first there's a procedure. You can take her. You can marry her. Isha. Sounds like it's actual marriage, right? It doesn't say sleep with her. It says take her as a wife. But then you have to wait. You can't do anything. So here there's a huge dispute between the Talmudim and between the commentaries. The Rambam thinks the best pshat, and I think it means that nothing happens. You desire her. But the Torah says don't do anything. You have to wait. You have to go through this process first. Others, including the Rambam, thinks that no, you're permitted to sleep with her one time. But then if you want to keep her, then there's this procedure. So that's the dispute. What Isha means. And the next verse is, again, the same question. Either after having done this, or if in order to marry, you must do the following, and that's verse number 3. It says, V'haveto toch beitecha, v'gyucha et rosha, v'yasta et tziporneha, v'esira et simlat shivya me'oleha, v'yashva b'veitecha, uvachta ta'via v'timo yerech yamim, v'yachar kein tavo ela uvalta v'ayta l'cha l'isha. So there are two different understandings. The Ramban's understanding, I think the plain understanding is, this is what you got to do. You desire this captive, but first you have to bring her into your household, and she trims her hair, she pares her nails, she discards her captive's clothing, she spends a month's time in your house lamenting her father and mother. After that, you come to her and become her husband, and she becomes your wife. That's one way to read it, okay? Another question is, what is the point of these? What is she doing over here? What is the idea of trimming the hair? The asta et tziporneha. Here they translate, she pares her nails. So here we have a great dispute between Rashi on one hand, who follows the position of Rabbi Akiva. The dispute of Rashi and the Ramban is found already in the Talmud. I'll mention Rashi and the Ramban. Rashi's position here is that everything she does is intended to make her disliked by the husband, so that after a month he's going to say to her, listen, we have to go our separate ways. What does it mean, v'asta et tziparneha? Lasot et tziparnayim. Rashi says, she not that she cuts her nails, she lets them grow. For Rashi, everything she does, the Torah intends to make her. You saw this beautiful woman. She looked beautiful to you in combat, but let her grow the long nails, let her shave her head, so she's not going to look, she's crying in your house all day. And you say to yourself, what do I need this for? She looked very different, a month ago. For Rashi, the intention is to discourage the husband. He desires her, but you shouldn't actually take her. You shouldn't actually take her. So that's the way Rashi understands it. That's Rashi's position. The Ramban and the Rambam certainly have a very different position. And the Rambam thinks that the Yostad Tziparneha and the Yuchad Rosha, etc., that what we're talking about over here, actually, removing the garments of the captive and staying in your house and crying for her parents for a month, that fundamentally what you have over here is I would say, two things. One is a time of mourning. Here you have a description of mourning, and we're actually familiar with it. They give a mourning period of 30 days. It doesn't actually surprise us. Shaving your head, Ramban says, we think of a mourner as not shaving, actually, but the Ramban points out that a response in the Bible, a response to death is sometimes to cut one's hair. In the first chapter of Eov, when Eov hears about the death of his children, he cuts his hair. By Yogos et Rosho, that the cutting of the hair is also seen as a kind of mourning period. So over here, what the Torah says is, you want to take her, you can take her, but we have to respect this woman because she's lost. Presumably, she's going to a different society. She's a captive. Maybe her father was even killed in battle. That's also possible. So we have to give her time to cry for her mother and father for 30 days. Only afterwards you can take her as a wife. That's the position. It's the opposite of Rashi. It's for the Rambam, it's out of respect for the woman. The Torah is concerned about the way you treat the captive. We have other places in Devarim, a concern for the captive, concern for the runaway slave, etc. So Sefer Devarim, the Rambam thinks, is focused on the way you treat this person. For Rashi, it's all about not marrying her. For the Rambam, that's not what this is about. You're permitted to marry her, but first you have to let her go through this particular process. I would add that another way to understand this of Bachtot Avia Vetima Yerech Yamim is that you don't want her to, and I don't think there's a contradiction here, but she has to let her past go. And you can't expect someone who just who's removed suddenly from her home to be able to acclimate to a totally new kind of situation. So therefore, we give her a period of time to acclimate to a new life, to sort of to mourn the past. But that was my past, and only afterwards, and to she's now a member of a new society. She changes her garments of the captive, and she cuts her hair, she takes care of her nails, etc. The dress is reflective of the new status of the person. So it's Rashi, the two very different ways to read it, as there are two different ways about what happened earlier. For the Ramban, nothing happened earlier. It's if you want to take her, this is the process you go through. And for Rashi, it's an attempt to dissuade. We don't want this marriage. It's coming out of lust. It's coming out of the moment, etc. In the words of the Talmud, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara. because there's another problem over here in this parsha. And that has to do with the next verse, with chapter 21, verse number 14. And the question is, how do you read chapter 21, verse number 14? There it says, V'haya im lo chafatzta ba. What after these 30 days you changed your mind? You saw during the war, etc., okay. But now after the 30-day period, you decide you don't really want her. Lo chafatzta ba. For Rashi, of course, that was the whole purpose of it. She's doing all these things that the Torah wants you to not to get involved. For the Rambam, that's not necessarily the case. But at the end of 30 days, you've called off for 30 days. It's not the heat of battle, etc., etc. You decide she's not for me. She's coming from some foreign country. Then v'shilach tova nafsha, you send her away. Umachar lo timkerena b'kosov, but you can't sell her. She's not a slave. She's a captive. Normally, captives are considered yours, but in this situation, that's not the case. She went through this whole process. Process of mourning, etc., etc. Lo tit'amer ba. You shall not. Well, tit'amer is a very good question. What tit'amer means? I think it means you can't exercise control over her. Related to the word amir with an aleph. Amir is a master. Lo tit'amer ba tachat asher en anita. After you have inita, you have mistreated her. Now, the word inita often is sexual. Sex which is not willing is called inui. So it's not clear what tachat asher inita means in this verse. Doesn't refer to the fact you've slept with her once in battle or shortly after battle. Rambam thinks you have to take it to a private place, but it doesn't matter. Or does it mean something different? Tachat asher inita does not mean that you slept with her, but it means she went through this process. She shaved her head, she paired her this, she took off the garments, she's been mourning for 30 days. There's a whole procedure over here. You put her through this whole procedure, and now you say, forget about it. After she's tried to acclimate herself to this new situation, and 30 days later you say, listen, I changed my mind. So the Torah says, you send her away. What's interesting is, you send her away, and here's the point. The Torah doesn't say when exactly you send her away. Do you send her away after the 30 days? Or do you decide you're not so interested, not after 30 days, maybe after 3 years? But if it's after 3 years, what bothers the commentaries is, what do you mean you just send her away? Because later in this section, it talks about when a man doesn't like his wife anymore, or hates her, he sends her away, but he gives her a bill of divorce. The Kotav law safer, he has to write for her a bill of separation. We call a get. And then she can go and marry somebody else. And the commentaries are bothered that the Torah over here never suggests that she needs a bill of divorce. It says he sends her away. B'shilach tova nafsha. You can't sell her, but you can send her away. So therefore the commentaries are suggesting that it probably means that right after the 30 days, you send her away. But if you actually married her, then she's a full wife, like any other wife, no difference. And then all the laws of marriage would apply, including if you want to terminate the marriage, you need to give a bill of divorce. So the section over here is actually an interesting section. It deals with, on one hand, war, a kind of prerogative of war. On the other hand, according to Rashi, certainly, the Torah allows you to do something for Rashi that is actually negative. That's what Rashi says. The Torah is trying to discourage it. On the other hand, the Torah allows it. So we have the expression, Dibra Torah keneged yetzer hara. The Torah speaks or addresses one's evil inclinations. And I think just to reflect on that for a moment, that's actually a very interesting point about law in general. And what I think can really, I think we should think about this, about what law is about. Law is not necessarily suggesting the best thing to do. Law deals with the reality, and I think that's actually a very important point. Without getting into the details of it here, but law in general deals with realities. Law doesn't necessarily mean that this is the ideal, but perhaps it sort of points us in a certain direction. Law, by definition, is a kind of very conservative implement. It reflects reality. It reflects reality of the moment, like in this case over here. It reflects reality of how people are thinking at that time. But what the law, I think, tries to do, what the Torah law often does, is it sends us in a certain direction. It's standing against the law. The Torah never eliminated slavery. So it didn't eliminate slavery of the non-Jew, and even of the Jew. It limits it to 6 years, etc., etc. But it doesn't say slavery is an evil. We can't have slavery. But by consistently limiting the common practice, it puts us it sends us to in a certain direction, and it's inviting, since we have an interpretive tradition, it's inviting us to take it further and to see slavery as an evil, period, and to eliminate slavery. So I think that is an important point, and the classic example, sorry for Rashi, and even the Ramban would probably agree with this, would be this called the Yefat Torah. The Torah is saying, the chashakta ba, you desired her. Cheshek can be positive or negative. It's in the moment, and the Torah says, okay, this is human nature, but you've got to go through this particular process. I want to mention something else. I didn't give you the exact quote, but I'll mention what it is. I mentioned the several places the Torah speaks about a war in Sefer Dvarim. I talked about that a bit, and there is an interesting section. It's in the sources. This is in chapter 23, verse number 10. Ki teitzei machaneh oivecha v'nishmarta mikol davar ra. This talks about the war camp. When you go out as a troop against your enemies, be on guard against anything untoward. And the Torah says that the camp of war, because God is present in the camp. Remember, that's what the Kohen said earlier. The Kohen says God is with you. God is in the machaneh. Therefore, that requires a certain kind of behavior, perhaps even a certain sanctity to it. So the Torah has all kinds of rules over here about behavior within the camp. You have to go outside the camp if you have for your needs, bathrooms or whatever it is. You have to go outside, etc. That's what it says. The Shema, because it says in verse number 17, because God walks amongst you. Ki Hashem Elohecha mitalech bekerev machanecha. On this verse, chapter 23, verse number 10, is a long Ramban. And this is a Ramban, I think, that is very, very important. The Ramban says, when you have a war camp against your enemy, you have to be careful not to do anything evil. The Ramban says, and the Torah speaks about the sanctity of the camp and all that. And the Ramban says, goes way beyond what the Torah said. The Torah gives you a couple of examples. But v'nishmarti mikol davar means something else, says the Ramban. When you're in war, says, this is the Ramban. When you're in war, soldiers can do terrible things. This, says the Ramban, is true of all armies. Terrible things can happen during a war. For the simple reason that war means you are permitted to and encouraged to kill. And therefore, as we say, hutra haritzua, what armies, the danger always is a lack of discipline and not adhering to the rules. And also you're fighting the enemy. So you can take all kinds of liberties. So the Ramban says, the nishmarti mikol davar ra is dafka in dafka. We always have to be careful, says the Ramban, about doing evil. But when it comes to armies, we have to be doubly and triply careful. That's nishmarti mikol davar ra. And this Ramban, he goes in great length about this. He doesn't mince any words either. And this Ramban actually fits in very well with what the Torah says in our section of the Yifat Toar, the Choshakta. Torah understands under conditions of war, all kinds of things can happen. Even in the most justified war, things happen. And therefore, we have to be triply careful about keeping the discipline and remembering the values dafka during war. Because dafka during war, there are all kinds of good reasons and explanations as to why people would do things that are not right. So that's the Ramban. Nishmarta mikol davar, anything, you got to be so extra special careful, says the Ramban. Okay, let me stop here and take comments or questions. And then I do want to say one other point, which is not, I didn't give the sources for it, but I will tell you one final point about Yifat Toar, which I think is interesting. Okay, let me just conclude with the following thought. First of all, I don't know if you know that I wrote a book in Hebrew several years ago called Malchut Adam. It's about kingship. It's about kingship as reflected in the book of Shmuel. It was written by my colleague. He wrote up my stuff. Named Ben Sion Ovadia. Writes gorgeous Hebrew, not an easy Hebrew. So I had this book translated to English, and I made some major edits in the book. It just came out. It's called Human Kingship, Studies in the Book of Samuel. I think it's really interesting, and it's out there. So if anybody wants to find out about the book, I'm not sure how one buys the book at this point, but it's I think it's a very easy read, and it's very interesting. And a lot of the stuff in the book, my students have studied with me over the years, so it's available. Human Kingship. I mention that not just because I want to tell everybody about the book. I'm excited about this book coming out. It was sponsored by Tova Beulah, one of our beloved students at Drisha for many years. But it's actually relevant to the next thing I want to talk about. I want to mention, and that is in the book of Shmuel. One of the most famous stories in the book of Shmuel, and obviously one of the more problematic stories in the book of Shmuel, is the story of David and Bathsheba. The story is, I'm sure, familiar to probably all of us. That David, the army is in war. King David stays home from the battle in 2 Samuel chapter 11 for whatever reason. We'll never know why. Doesn't go to battle. He sleeps during the daytime. He goes on the roof towards night and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. He inquires who she is. He's told that she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite and the daughter of Eliam, two of his soldiers actually. He calls for her if he sleeps with her, he sends her away. But the story does not end there because she sends back to him a message, I am pregnant. And that's a problem for King David. Not just a personal problem for King David, as they talk about in the book. It's a problem for the kingship. Kings don't want a potential king child having another family. That's a complication. David doesn't want that. So apart from the personal problem, he's got a problem with the kingship. So he sends for Uriah Hittite from the battle on the pretext of wanting to find out about the battle. But the reality is he wants to send him home to be with his wife. And then if she has a baby 8 months later or whatever it is, nobody will know who the father is. That doesn't work. Because Uriah the Hittite, for whatever reason, not getting into that now, refuses to go home. David tries once, David tries twice, and finally he realizes Uriah is not going home. So he writes a note to Uriah, a sealed note. And the note essentially says, the idea is, kill me. He has Uriah bring the note to the general, Yoav. Uriah dies in the battle. I'm not getting into how he dies, etc. There's all kinds of interesting complications. It's in the book. But what's interesting is, after Uriah the Hittite dies, he dies. And then we have the following two verses at the end of chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. Two verses. It says the following. David has been told that Uriah is dead. He's told by the messenger Uriah is dead. Fine. Vatishma eshet Uriah Kimet Uriah Isha. The wife of Mrs. Uriah, that's Bathsheba, she's called the wife of Uriah. Mrs. Uriah hears that Uriah, her husband, has died. Vatisbold al Bala. She laments her husband. Hesped. Hesped in the Bible does not mean to give eulogy, by the way. Hesped in the Bible means to do actions that reflect one's grief. For example, we say in the 30th Psalm, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, Hafachta Mispedi L'Macholi. You turn my hesped into dance. In other words, my gestures of grief are turned into gestures of happiness. Or, for example, in the book of Kohelet, everything has a time, everything has a season, right? La Kozman. Eis Rekod, the Eight Sephod, a time to dance and a time for hesped. Dance, you move your body joyously. Hesped, you move your body in sadness. It's gestures which reflects, that's what hesped means in the Bible. Hesped in rabbinic thinking, we today hesped means a eulogy. That's not what it means. So, Vatispoda Ba'ala, some kind of a gesture, she's doing something which demonstrates sorrow about the death of her husband. Vayavar ha'evel, after the period of mourning has passed. Vayishlach David vayasfa el beito, vatilo leisha. After the period of mourning has passed, David gathers her into his house. She becomes his wife, and she gives birth to his child. Vayera davar she'asa David b'nei Hashem, but what David did was evil in God's eyes. The description of Bathsheba. She mourns her husband. She's a period of mourning, after which David gathers her into his house, and he marries her. Having slept with her once, by the way, is precisely the way the Torah describes the Yifat Torah, the woman taken as captive in war. To the extent that, whether you think this is the pshat in the Chumash or not, according to many, he slept with her once, but now he wants to marry her. He has to go through the process, and then he takes her as a wife. So leaving out the question of sleeping with her once, which of course was exactly the story of David, but what is the point? Why has the writer of the book of Samuel presented Bathsheba in this way? And what's interesting is that in the Chumash, the language is Ubachta Taviyavi Ma Yerech Yamin, right? Right? V'yachar Kain Tavoy Lev, and afterwards it's permissible. But in early it said you should take her into your house. Va'veita el toch beitecha, bring her into your house. So here we have Bathsheba with the period of mourning, and the time of mourning has passed. Here it doesn't say he brings her into his house. Here he gathered her into his house. There's a difference between bringing into the house and gathering. Because bringing means you have this one person you bring to your house, but to gather things in suggests you gather in a bunch of things, not just one thing. He adds it to his collection. And here's the point that I make in the book, and about the way the Yifat Torah story functions in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And the way it functions here is this. King David, for whatever reason, there's a war against Ammon. It's a war, by the way, that David himself started. It's not a war that just happens. David starts the war by making a bad mistake, by reaching out to the Ammonites, which the Torah in the book of Devarim forbids. Do not get involved with these people. It's a war David starts. But then, for whatever reason, he sends out all the troops, including Uriah Hittite. He sends the warriors out to fight. For whatever reason, David stays home. For whatever reason, he has no interest in this war. He sleeps during the daytime. He stands on he's we have the expression to walk the walls, right? So he walks on the roof, sees this woman. He knows who she is. She's a married woman. He knows that, but he knows her husband's off in battle, so he sleeps with her, sends her away, and then he's got a problem. She's pregnant, so he then uses the war. He's got to get Uriah home. He gets him home on the pretext of having him report about the war. How's the war going? David couldn't care less. How's the war going? Very good. Go back to your wife. Go back to your wife. R&R. Go back to your wife. He refuses to go. David wants him, tries again, refuses to go. David sends a note back. Here, take this note back to the general against the pretext about the war, which he could care less. And what does the letter really say? Take him into the middle of the battle, retreat the troops from him, and have him die. He's going to use the war to kill Uriah Hittite. And the coup de grace, the conclusion of the chapter, of course, is how does he see Uriah Hittite? How does he see Bathsheba? Bathsheba is the captive that you take when you're fighting your enemy. What David has managed to do in this chapter is transform Uriah, the most noble of warriors, into the enemy of the Jewish people, when in fact he's not the enemy of the Jewish people at all. He's fighting for the Jewish people. If there is an enemy of the Jewish people in the story, it's David himself. It's so in that Uriah Hittite, and the writer can't refrain, of course, of Shmuel. He turns Bathsheba into an Eshet Yifat Toar. When you fight against your enemies and God defeats your enemies, and then you have the Eshet Yifat Toar, he's managed to transform the storyteller of Samuel. Uriah Hittite, from one of David's Giborim, he's listed as one of the great warriors of David, and he gets treated by the end of the story as the enemy of the people. And David manages to fool the world, except you can't fool God in the book of Shmuel, and the matter is very evil in God's eyes. So I've just pointed out how it's interesting. Once you see this, it's obvious, but it's not so easy to see it. How the story of the Yifat Toar was conscripted by the writer of Samuel to present a fuller picture of David and not a very pretty picture. In any event, so we began with the Yifat Toar, I would say the captive consort. What the Torah thinks of this, the Torah is not crazy about the idea, that's for sure. There's just a question of how not crazy we are. Rashi has his point of view, and the Ramban and others say, listen, this is life. This is what happens in life, and the laws have to deal with reality. They try to move us in the best direction possible. They deal with reality. This is human nature. This is reality. This is the nature of war. Even the most justified war, says the Ramban. This is what it is. So this is the parsha of Yifat Toar. This is what we did today. Next week we'll deal with a very difficult parsha from a rabbinic standpoint called Moti Shemra. That's a very interesting parsha. That's for next week. So we have these extra classes. We have 3 more classes. It's good to be studying with you, and looking forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you next week as we learn more this summer. I just want to reiterate, we do have some more classes with Rabbi Silber happening over the course of the next 2 months. First, if you are free on Mondays at 1 p.m., please join our summer kollel for an afternoon class with Rabbi Silber on his class on Shimshon. He is also teaching Mishnah in depth on Kalim. This is an asynchronous class with videos released monthly. If you would like those videos sent straight to your inbox, you can sign up for that at drisha.org/classes. Hope to see you all next week, and take care.
Thank you.